Good morning, and it's good to be together. In just a minute, you are going to be starting your class with Miriam and Allison Young is going to introduce our guests. I just wanted to also say that this morning we are starting a second adult class that's going to meet for the next 6 weeks that is called Start Here, and some of you know about that class, have taken it. But it is down in the adult class, and it's for people who are maybe new Christians or new to APC who'd like to figure out kind of what does that mean to be a part of a community of faith, where do I go from here, where do I get started. So if somebody wanders in here and is like, you know, kind of looking a little bit lost or misplaced, they might be looking for Start Here. So if somebody could just show hospitality and point them down to the adult ed room, we're going to be down there for the next several weeks. But I'm so glad that you all are here, and I'm going to turn it over to Allison. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Hey, Helen. Apple juice for fellowship now. So anybody that feels like they could donate, I sent that home today.
Oh,
and we
okay.
borrowed some from Little Tree,
All
but
right.
we need apple juice.
All right, we're looking for apple juice.
Thanks, Allison.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to introduce our Mental Health Matters series of classes. We're here for 3 weeks with Miriam Diephouse-McMillan, who has written a wonderful book. I first got hold of this in the spring as a lucky pre-reader, and as soon as I read it, I thought, oh my goodness, we have to introduce this in so many places at APC. So that's been an ongoing thing. Miriam's here for 3 weeks to talk about the book and lead us through some of the practices. We have books available. Deb's back here with a box full. You are welcome to borrow a book, and if you want to own it, it's $15. Whenever you're good for it, you can turn that over to us. But please take the opportunity to take a book and have a look at it. It's filled with so much information, so practical, but so simply written that you can easily take it on, even if you're not a big reader. So I'm going to turn it over to Miriam. Here she is.
Thank you so much, Allison. I've got this on. It's great to be back with you all. I recognize some familiar faces. I was here last October for a little preview. We talked about mental health in the Bible, and I'm back to share a little bit about the book. And I wanted to start with a little bit of history of sort of how we got here. I am a full-time chaplain at Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. I'm also an ordained Presbyterian minister. I went to Princeton Seminary. But I've been at the hospital full-time ever since I graduated. So I've always had kind of one foot into the spirituality and faith world and one foot in the mental health world, or maybe 2 feet in the mental health world. And through my work in working with patients and hearing about kind of what's going on in the mental health field, I kept noticing all these sort of new ideas that were coming out of the mental health field sounded very similar to things that I had learned in seminary about prayer practices, about deeper awareness in our faith, the more sort of contemplative strands of Christian tradition. And I was like, these aren't new, right? The mental health field is just discovering them, but we've had them for thousands of years. And they might call them something different and have their trendy words for it. And now they can do cool research studies about how these practices actually impact our brains, which is what I get all excited and nerdy about. And if you're excited and nerdy about brain scans and figuring out what happens in our brains when you pray, I'm going to be doing a talk on November 2nd at my home church in Pennington Presbyterian Church at 3:30 p.m. on that Sunday, November 2nd. So I will bring, next week I will hopefully have the flyers, and I'll bring those and hand them out in case you're interested. But just know that I can get very nerdy into the research side. I'm going to try not to do that to you all today, but I have, one foot in that world as well. So in particular, I'm interested in these spiritual practices, these ancient ways of praying that have been a part of our tradition for thousands of years, and how they actually help us maintain mental health, how they're actually good for our brains, for our bodies, for our overall well-being, in addition to obviously being good for our spirituality and our connection with God. That's what this is all about. So this 3-week series, I'm going to try to give you as much of the practices as I can. I'm going to do 2 practices a week with kind of a theme through each one. So the ones that we're going to be looking at today are called Centering Prayer and Practicing the Presence of God. And I wanted to start here because the whole purpose of spiritual practices is about deepening our faith, growing our awareness of God's presence with us. We all believe and affirm that God is with us all the time. Right? We say that in church. We sing. And so there are 2 ways that we're going to do that today. There is a more structured practice called centering prayer. This is something that is more what we think of when we think of structured spiritual practices. It's something that you have to do regularly to kind of reap the benefits of. It is a type of prayer that doesn't necessarily use words. When we think about prayer, we often think about like conversation with God. I say this, maybe I listen for God's message back to me. But centering prayer is often done in silence. It's about being in the presence of God in a non-intellectual way, in a more soulful, heartfelt way. And that can feel a little uncomfortable for those of us who have been raised that, church is when we say these particular words, and prayer is when we do, say a set list of words. We're not all very comfortable sitting in silence. That's not a part of our culture. And so it can take some getting used to, and it might feel a little uncomfortable, but like any exercise, like any practice, the more you do it, the easier it becomes. So I often recommend start with just a couple minutes, right? Just sit in silence for 2 minutes and see how that feels. And then maybe after you do that a few times, you can increase it. And, a lot of the recommended things for centering prayer are like 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. And don't start there, right? You don't walk into the gym and pick up 100 pounds on your first day. You pick up the 5-pound weight and get used to that, and you work your way up. And spiritual practices are the same way. The other practice that I'm going to talk about, we won't necessarily get to practice it specifically today, but it's one that you can practice literally at any time, no matter what you're doing. It's called practicing the presence of God. And what that means is simply becoming aware of God's presence in whatever activity you happen to be doing at the time. So you could be washing the dishes, you could be folding the laundry, you could be driving to work. And it can be a spiritual practice if you bring the intention of God's presence with you. Inviting God to sit on the passenger seat as you're driving to work, right? And see how that changes your experience of that practice. This is a great one for those of us who consider ourselves too busy for spiritual practices, right? Like, I can't set aside 20 minutes a day because I've got kids and I've got a job and I've got a book and, there's a lot going on. But I'm always commuting to work or washing the dishes or doing the laundry. Those are things that are already a part of my life. I don't have to set aside time for that. But I can make it a spiritual practice with intention, with awareness of God's presence with me. So the theme of these is about God's presence being with us and intentionality, that a lot of spiritual practices are about becoming more intentional about what we're doing and how God is with us in that. So I want to give a little history of some of these practices. Oh, I have some quotes here. So these are quotes from the book that are just sort of pithy little descriptions of each prayer. Centering prayer, we sit in stillness and quiet our minds to make space for the one who is already there. And practicing the presence of God is inviting God into the nitty-gritty details of our life, only to realize that God is already there, keeping us company as we go about our day. So again, that theme is that God is already with us. We already know that. We believe that. And the practice is making ourselves more aware of that. That's what we need help with. So let's get a little into the history of centering prayer in particular first. It started with a group of early Christians in about the 3rd century known as the Desert Elders. And these were sort of the first monastics in our church history. So we're a group of people who separated themselves out of kind of the daily grind of life and went off to live in the desert, a very ascetic lifestyle, and really focused themselves on connecting with God. And they talk a lot about praying from the heart instead of with words. And that comes into this tradition of centering prayer, that we're not necessarily using words, but we're connecting to God through our heart. And the teachings of these desert elders got passed down through Christian tradition, both in Eastern Christianity and the Orthodox Church. There are some very long-standing monastic traditions in the Greek Orthodox faith that really date themselves back to this and use very similar techniques of sort of praying in silence and trying to invite God's presence in every moment of every day. And in the Western tradition, starting with Catholicism, but it does branch out into Protestantism, as we'll get to in a minute, that came through the medieval mystics. So these monks and nuns in the Middle Ages who, again, had separated themselves out from the world and started focusing on connecting with God. And a lot of them use this really deep, intimate language to describe this awareness of God's presence that they had. Coming now into the 20th century, they were a group of American Catholics, Trappist monks, Father Thomas Keating, William Meninger, and Basil Pennington, all Trappist Catholic fathers. And they looked into this history of medieval Christianity and all the way back to the Desert Elders, and they wanted to make it more applicable to modern life. They said these practices are valuable. How can we help people engage with these practices? And so they developed what is now sort of the standard format for centering prayer. They have an organization called Contemplative Outreach, if this is something you're interested in learning more about, that sort of continues on their teachings and trying to help people engage with centering prayer. But the type of centering prayer that I'm going to be guiding us through later this morning is sort of based roughly on their work. And because of their work, centering prayer expanded out beyond monasteries, beyond these isolated, specialized religious people, into something that every Christian can engage in some way. Catholic, Protestant, wherever you are. And again, the theme comes from Scripture here. Be still and know that I am God. Centering prayer is about stilling our minds and our bodies to become more aware that God is and that God is with us. Practicing the presence of God, our second practice that I'm going to talk about today, comes from a history of Christians who read this verse from 1 Thessalonians about praying without ceasing. And they said, how on earth are we supposed to do that? Right? I can't be praying every minute of every day because I have to wash the dishes and I have to cook dinner and, life has to happen. And so there were different interpretations of what does it mean to pray without ceasing. There was, in the monastic tradition where a lot of these practices were preserved over time, there was a motto in a lot of the monasteries. In Latin, it's ora et labora, which means to pray and to work, which is sort of the rhythm of monastic life, right? They had hours of prayer, but there was also work to be done, right? A lot of the monasteries had farms, or they would go out into the community and do charity work, or they had, they did a lot of transcribing of scripture. So there was work to be done, but there was also prayer. And over time, that motto actually shifted to be interpreted as to work is to pray. That there was not actually that much division between the work that they did as monks or nuns and also the prayer. That the prayer life was meant to be integrated into the work. And so this idea of what does it mean to be praying while we're working, right? How do we invite God into whatever it is we're doing? In particular, in the 17th century, there was a French monk named Brother Lawrence. He was an uneducated monk, just joined the monastery, and I think he was assigned to the kitchen as his primary task. But he developed this reputation for being a very wise spiritual teacher. And so the other monks in the monastery would come and sit at his feet and ask him questions. And he started to talk about what he called practicing the presence of God. And he talked about cooking and cleaning and saying, I do them purely for the love of God. So when I'm cooking a meal, I'm not just cooking for my brothers in the monastery, I'm cooking for God. And when I'm cleaning pots, I'm cleaning pots for God. And his teachings were written down by some of the more educated monks and preserved in a book that's actually called Practicing the Presence of God, that has been translated and carried on till today. Another French monk, this one's a Jesuit monk from the 18th century, wrote a book called The Sacrament of the Present Moment, Jean-Pierre de Caussade. And he took a lot of these teachings, similar to what Brother Lawrence was saying, about the present moment, whatever it is you're doing right now, sitting in your chair, attending a worship service, going to the grocery store, is sacramental because of our awareness of God in that, right? We can find God in the everyday activities that we do. We don't have to wait until Sunday morning to get to God. A lot of the language, in particular in that book about the present moment, is going to sound really familiar to anyone who's heard about contemporary mindfulness training, right? Mindfulness is all about the present moment. It's like a catchphrase in mindfulness, especially the way mindfulness is taught in the mental health world where I work. That tradition, the mindfulness tradition that has become popularized in the US, comes from Buddhist tradition, but there is a lot of overlap with the contemplative strands of Christian tradition. And if you go back into the Middle Ages, there was a lot of sharing of information between different faith traditions, and there were sort of different strands of that in each faith tradition. And so this practicing the presence of God is the Christian equivalent, the Christian historical thread that connects to contemporary mindfulness. That we're not just mindful of what's happening in the present moment, we're mindful of God in the present moment. That's what makes it a little bit different, is that we are inviting God into, or inviting ourselves to be aware of God's presence in these day-to-day activities. So the scripture verse that supports our practice of this comes from the book of Joshua, that the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So it's up to us to notice that, to attend to that, and to practice it. So both of these two practices are really about promoting that awareness, promoting our openness to God's presence, which we know is already there. And we call that contemplative practice. And that's that tradition that roots back to those desert elders through the monastic traditions. But it is something that we can all practice. You don't have to go join a monastery to practice contemplative prayer. It's something we can bring into every day. So that's the sort of seminary side of my perspective on these practices. What about the mental health side? What do these practices actually do? Now, it sounds great, obviously, to become more aware of God's presence. We know that's good for us, right? We want to become closer to God. But we actually know from research now what happens in our minds when we engage in these type of practices. What actually changes for us? So I'm going to go through this list and just give you little snippets, not diving too deep into the research, about how we know these practices are good for us. And this research, a lot of it does focus more on that mindfulness tradition, but there are researchers who specifically study Christian prayer. I've read a cool study about somebody who went on, or did brain scans of people who went on an Ignatian retreat. And Ignatius is a Christian leader who teaches a lot of contemplative type prayer practices. So these are the same practices that are in my book. And they studied people's brains before they went on the week-long retreat and then after. And they can see what's different in their brains, which I think is fascinating. One of the things that they know from research is that contemplative practices reduce anxiety and stress. They change things like blood pressure, sleep habits, and then changes in the amygdala, which is the part of your brain that controls your stress response, your fight or flight response. So the changes that they noticed were a decreased activity in that stress response. So they can actually see how these prayer practices make you less stressed out, which I think is kind of cool, because that fits with a lot of people's personal experience, right? When we engage our spirituality with intention, we feel better, right? And we know that, and our faith has been teaching us that for thousands of years. And now we can see it on a brain scan. It's kind of cool. Another change that they noticed is increases in the areas of the brain related to creativity and compassion. So the parts of our brain that help us with learning and being open-minded, and the parts that are related to empathy and connecting with others show actual increase in brain matter over time through these mindfulness and contemplative practices. And again, people's personal experience reflects that when we engage in these practices, we feel more connected to others, and we feel more open to the world, and maybe we get new insights, and maybe we can feel more connected to God's insight in our life, right? The guiding of the Holy Spirit in what we're doing. Related to that is this idea of freedom of choice. A lot of what happens in our life when we're not contemplative, when we're not mindful, is we go on autopilot, right? And some of that is just how our brains work, right? Certain routines we do without thinking so that we can save our brain for more important things that we need to think about. But the more on autopilot we are, the less control we have over our reactions to things that might happen in our lives. So practicing mindfulness, practicing awareness of God can help us to see things from a different perspective. So the example I gave about inviting God to sit with me on my commute to work. Now, most days when I'm driving to work, I'm thinking about what I got to do that day. Maybe I'm annoyed about somebody driving slow in traffic because I'm running late, right? I'm in my own head and I have my own worries. What might shift when I imagine God with me in that car, right? Am I going to have a different perspective on that person who cut me off in traffic? Am I going to be more compassionate towards them? Am I going to recognize that being late is not the end of the world, right? It shifts our perspective and helps us to see more from God's point of view and kind of zoom out of some of our own little worries. And that gets into the shifting in mental perspective. All of these themes are a little bit related to each other, but we kind of zoom out and see the bigger picture of what's going on and God's work in the world. And along with that comes joy and gratitude. What happens when we're kind of zoomed into our little worries is we miss the beautiful sunset as we're driving home from work, right? Or we don't pay attention to the little things that could be bringing us joy in life. And when we invite God's presence into our day-to-day activities, we find joy in those activities and we find gratitude for God's presence, right? We start to be thankful for all the things that God has done for us because God's right there with us, right? And we engage in gratitude and joy. I talked about the shift in mental perspective. And then, of course, promoting spiritual connection, right? That's the whole point of spiritual practices, is to be more aware of God and invite that deeper relationship. like any relationship in our lives, relationships get better when you spend more time with the person, right? If you want to get to know God better, if you want to develop your spiritual life, what better way to do it than to intentionally spend some time with God? And that doesn't mean you have to sit in church every day of the week, right? God is with you wherever you are. So that is the theme. I do want to make sure we have some time for questions before we move into a practice of contemplative prayer. I'm going to lead us through a centering prayer practice, but I want to open it up if there are any questions before we do that.
Seems when you were talking about increasing creativity and capacity, you use the phrase increased brain matter. Did you just mean increased activity in existing brain matter? You're just talking about activating the brain, not increasing.
So,
There's increased density of gray matter in specific areas of the brain related to compassion and creativity. And then there's other scans, other studies that show increased connectivity between different parts of the brain. So they've studied both.
Is that amongst dead brain matter, like people who've had strokes and such like?
No, I haven't seen any studies particularly on
Okay.
brain injury related to this. There's a very cool one about depression. And the parts of the brain that tend to shrink with depression are the same ones that get strengthened by spiritual practices. And so spiritual practices actively help build resilience against depression. They can't prevent depression, but for people who've experienced depression, engaging in spiritual practices helps develop some resilience and develop a regrowth of some of those areas of the brain.
You may be about to get into this, but earlier you were speaking about sitting in silence.
Mhm.
And sitting is a word that I've heard several times already. I'm just wondering, is there a posture for sitting?
Not specifically. I mean, in different traditions, I know in like the Buddhist meditation tradition, there are very specific postural instructions. In centering prayer, it's encouraged to be comfortable, but not too sleepy. Those are the specifics that I've heard, right? If you lay down in your bed and try to practice centering prayer, maybe it'll work. Chances are you're probably going to fall asleep, right? And sleep is great. We can invite God into our sleep as well, but that's different. That's not necessarily a practice in the same way. Practicing the presence of God, there is definitely no posture for it. It's whatever you happen to be doing at the time. Centering prayer tends to be done seated, but I don't know any reason why you couldn't do it standing up. But the idea is to be restful in your body, to not be too active. Any other questions?
Did anything surprise you as you were writing this book, as someone who's been sitting with this studying this?
Lots of things surprised me. One of the biggest surprises was I was trying to be intentional about recognizing the contemplative tradition in other branches of Christianity other than, traditional white Protestant and Catholic Christianity. And there is some great research already being done out there about contemplation in the American Black church tradition. So there are some great books I can recommend if you're curious about that. But that it manifests a little bit differently because it's a different cultural tradition. But that this sort of praying from the heart, this sort of emotional connection to God, and this sense of finding joy through God's presence in daily life is woven throughout the Black church tradition as well. So that was one piece of research that really kind of reshaped my understanding of the traditions of these practices. And then the brain research always gets me excited because I think these things are valuable. I think, and I see in my own life and with the patients that I work with, that practicing these things helps people. But it's so cool to see why and how, right? What's actually changing in someone's brain when you're engaging in those practices.
Did you find in your study that once you were doing this sort of Christian spiritual practicing, that people felt more of a connection to Buddhists and to Native Americans and to other cultures that had similar practices? Or did it stay discreet,
I think it depends a lot on the person. In my work as a chaplain, I'm an interfaith chaplain, and so I work within whatever the person's own faith tradition is. And so people tend to relate it to their own experience. I know a lot of people who've engaged in contemplative prayer who say, oh, this is kind of what we do in yoga, right? Like, and they do feel some similarity to things that they've learned in other settings, other contexts. My own personal take is that there is actually a lot in common between a lot of these spiritual traditions. They are distinct. They each have their own history and their own belief structure, but some of the practices are actually very similar. That contemplative spirituality is very similar across different faith traditions.
I mean, because of this, the comparison of compassion and tolerance, you know, the idea that we're alike, so we're more tolerant. Yeah.
Yeah, about recognizing the similarities in other people as a way to find that compassion, right, and find that empathy. And that is also very common. We have a poster in one of our rooms in the chapel at the hospital that has the golden rule: treat others the way you would like to be treated, and how it's found in the writings of all the different world religions, right? That is actually something that is in common. The value of compassion is a common value across spiritual traditions around the world. And obviously we can look at our own scriptures and the things that Jesus says about this, right? And how we should treat others. And what's unique, I will say, about Christianity, and this is a chapter we'll get to in a couple of weeks from my book, is about loving our enemies. Very few other traditions talk about loving enemies. So that is a unique step that Christianity takes even further from just showing compassion to others, but actually actively trying to care for those who have harmed us. But we're going to get there in a couple weeks, so I don't want to go too deep.
Hi, quick question first, because I missed the first few. I know mindfulness is something that, you know, many people practice, and it's well known. And then there's contemplation. So what do you think what would you say, I guess, it's the biggest difference between contemplation and mindfulness as you practice it?
That's a great question, because I think those two terms do overlap quite a bit. And I think a lot of it is context, right? I think mindfulness is a buzzword in our society today, and it's taken from a particular, you know, Zen Buddhist heritage, but it's been kind of watered down and thrown out there, and now it's being used a lot in mental health language as just a tool, right? It's been sort of isolated from its faith heritage and just used as a tool. But when we engage in the tradition of contemplative prayer, that is a uniquely Christian tradition, we're sort of reconnecting it back. Now, the word contemplation isn't unique to Christianity, but contemplative prayer is contextually a type of tradition that is a part of our heritage.
And I guess just following on that, that's where a lot of the mental health is also a part of it. Or is it AA? Where you have to believe in someone greater than yourself. Yeah. And so I guess that's where the contemplative prayer kind of brings it all together.
Yeah. Right. And so for different people, that higher power might have different theology behind it than what we know in our own tradition. But that the value of having a higher power is recognized as important in recovery, right? And that's true in the substance use recovery world, but it's also true in other forms of mental health issues. And that's where a lot of the interesting research is being done right now, is what is the role of our faith in our ability to cope with whatever illness we might be struggling with.
I'm just curious, when you're introducing practices in your work with patients, do you talk about the brain's aspect of it, or is that interesting?
Depends on the person.
Yeah.
Some people are like, they're like, I don't want to have anything to do with spirituality, but if I tell them that there's brain studies that show that this practice is effective, they're like, okay, I'll try it. And other people are like, I don't care about the brain science, I just know that my faith is important to me and I want to engage it in this way. So I think like any of us, we have our interests and we're motivated by different things. And a lot of the patients I work with have either a lower educational level or like cognitive disabilities of some kind that make that stuff not really accessible to them. So I'm not going to throw it out there and confuse people. I'm going to say, hey, let's just try this, right? And make it concrete. The same way we would often do with children, right? We make something really concrete. And I don't mean to say that people with disabilities are equated with children, but in terms of the developmental level, right? Using concrete language and concrete practice is more effective than abstracting things.
I was just going to say, I work in a secular environment and we practice a lot of these centering kind of activities and grounding and practicing the presence. And I was wondering if you feel the same way I can't obviously like express my personal faith or any kind of bias, but it is so weird and miraculous that it feels like a lot of times when I engage in these practices with people, God just shows up. And you're like, this is a person that has never expressed any faith to me at all. And I haven't like verbally said anything influencing. And then all of a sudden there's like, God is right there.
Yeah, I completely agree. And some of the researchers, there's an interesting book called The Awakened Brain by Lisa Miller that got a lot of press a year or so ago. But she basically argues that like we are wired for spiritual engagement, like based on her brain scans and things that she's done. That like, and so engaging these practices brings that out of people, right? It helps them connect to it in a way they might not otherwise.
Yes, various examples. They're universal when we think in terms of seeking peace of mind, transcendental meditation. In our perspective, we're just trying to draw closer to God. But this study, where and when did it begin? Because it's something that it's been around for centuries. Different civilizations, people have attempted to accomplish this.
Yeah, so I think it has begun with human history, right? Like you said, these practices have been around. Now, the field of psychology has only been around for what, 150 years, right? And now the ability to scan people's brains is even shorter than that, right? We're talking 30, 40 years of the ability to do that. So it's the same pursuit, we just have different tools to approach it.
It's the first thing that came into my mind, various examples that you gave from Jesuits, monks, being raised Catholic. I immediately thought in terms of everything that I was taught and was told to do was contrary. That was if anything, it was a form of compulsive neurosis. 3 of these and 2 of those and this and that, and that's what I wrote in church.
Yeah, and there is some interesting research about what types of engagement with faith are more helpful for mental well-being than others. And obviously everyone's different. Prayer beads actually, I'm assuming we're talking rosaries when we talk about numbers of prayers, right? Prayer beads are actually common in various different world religions. So there is something about the tangible nature and the repetition. You know, we think about mantras in the Buddhist tradition, right, of repetition. There is a value for that. But how we engage our faith is more indicative of mental well-being than just that we follow the rules. And there's actually studies that show that now. That just, following authoritarian structure doesn't give you a lot of well-being, but engaging on a personal level, right? Having this more depth of awareness of God's presence is much more healing for our minds and our bodies. And so I think we also can recognize that each of us has different needs and is going to find different ways to access that are meaningful for us. And so for some person, a rosary might be really calming. And for others, it just feels, repetitive and redundant. And so in the introduction to the book, I mentioned that this is a toolbox, right? These are all different practices. You don't have to do all of them. You can look for the ones that look appealing. You can try them all and then decide which ones you like. And maybe you find one that really works for you right now, and 10 years down the road, your life looks different, and you pick up the book again and you try a different practice, and you find it really meaningful. Because it's a toolkit. It's different ways to engage our faith that have different outcomes, different aspects of well-being for us. Wonderful questions. I wish we could keep talking.
One based on what Ron was saying now, my mom, who's in her 90s, has got dementia, serious dementia, and saying her rosary is like a touchstone to her faith. She feels, I can tell her mental spirit lifts when she holds on to her beads and starts praying things that she has known her whole life. She won't remember her name, but she'll remember the blessed mysteries.
Yeah.
And it makes her better in that moment.
Absolutely.
What a wonderful story.
Yeah. I have a similar story, not about prayer beads, but about the power of rituals and sacraments. We had a patient who did have a brain injury and who couldn't engage in regular conversation, would just repeat the same, pieces of a story over and over, no matter what you said in response, but had been raised Catholic. And whenever we would have Mass, when the priest would come in, as soon as the priest brought out the little pyx, the little container that the Eucharist came in, this gentleman would stand up and come and stand right in front. He knew exactly what to do. He was able to engage in his faith in this very concrete ritual. And that's what sacraments are, right? They're making God's presence concrete in our lives, right? And so I think that's a beautiful image, similar to the rosary, of ways for people to connect, regardless of what other limitations they may have. All right, I want to make sure we have a little bit of time to engage in some centering prayer today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this prayer can feel uncomfortable. If you're not used to sitting in silence, it's going to feel weird. So just expect that and be gentle with yourself about that, right? Don't expect it to feel wonderful the first time. You may, find yourself distracted by lots of things going on in the room or your own body. That is all part of the process. That is all welcome and expected if we can approach ourselves with compassion, right? That the goal of this time is simply to be present with God. So I'm going to kind of talk us through the steps first, so that you know where we're headed, and then I will, actually bring us into the prayer. It's all good. I'm going to talk us through the steps, but the majority of the prayer time will actually be spent in silence. And I'm going to aim for about 3 minutes, which might feel really long to some people, and it might feel short to some people, and that's okay. We're just going to try it out and remind yourself of the goal. So the first step is always to set our intention, right? What is the point of this spiritual practice? It's to spend time in God's presence, right here in this room. That's different than daydreaming. That's different than napping. It's different than making your grocery list. Now, those thoughts might come into your head, but having named your intention to yourself can be a reminder to come back, right? Similarly, the way that these Trappist monks created centering prayer in its current form is they invite you to choose a sacred word. This can be a name for God. It can be a quality that you would like from God, like peace or comfort. For everyone, it can be different. If you find yourself getting hung up on I got to choose a word, pick your favorite name for God. Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus, right? It doesn't have to be anything fancy. For some people, even the idea of a word or short phrase doesn't work, and they prefer visual images. So the image of a candle or a baptismal font or a cross, right? A visual image. And the idea of this is it serves as an anchor, because our minds are really good at wandering. And so we need something to pull us back. And so the word or the image is just a grounding that you can come back to whenever you notice your mind going elsewhere. Again, noticing distractions, returning to the word. Again, trying to be gentle with ourselves and not judging. Now, the first, I don't know how many times I practiced centering prayer, I would sit there and I'm like, okay, here's my sacred word. Oh, how long is this going to last? Oh, shoot, I'm supposed to be praying. Okay, the sacred word. Okay, all right, I'm praying. Okay. Oh, what was that noise in the other room? Oh, shoot, I'm supposed to be praying. And I would get so angry at myself for being distracted that it was really hard to settle into the prayer. And so I was reminded by the spiritual teachers in my life to simply welcome those distractions and maybe even name them. Oh, I'm getting distracted. I'm going to come back. But without that physical jump and that pressure on myself, right? To just invite ourselves back. Okay, I'm going to pray. Here's my sacred word. Oh, I'm distracted again, and I come back. And it's the coming back that is building our muscles in our brain, right? It's building our awareness of God every time we come back. So it's not a problem that we get distracted. It's a part of the practice. It's why we keep coming back. And then we'll end the time of prayer in silence, and this is just for a moment of reflection to just notice how you feel, notice any experience. Not everybody's going to have a profound spiritual breakthrough the first time you do centering prayer, or any time that you just do centering prayer. So if you do, great, but don't feel like you're missing something if you're yeah, I just sat there for a minute and now I'm done.
Absolutely. Yeah, any of those would be fine.
Whatever one associates with and feels is lacking in your life, you associate that word with that's what Jesus would say.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So whatever word comes to you at the beginning of our time of centering prayer can be your word for this. And it might be the same. Some people find a word and that's their centering prayer word for whatever their duration of practice, months, years. Other people, it's a different word every day, right? Because they need something different from God or they're having a different experience of God every day. So again, it's very flexible. You can adapt it to whatever you need as long as the focus is on awareness of God. That's really the core of this practice. Any other questions about the logistics of the prayer? All right, let's go ahead and begin. So take a moment to settle yourself. Just be in your body a little bit. Find a comfortable position that you can sit reasonably for about 3 minutes. And set your intention for this time. Remind yourself that we are here to become more aware of God's presence with us for the next few moments. As you're ready, try to select a sacred word or image that can be your anchor for this practice. And you can begin to silently repeat that word or phrase or picture that image as we begin our time of silence. I will check in about halfway through just as an invitation to come back from our distractions, but continue your prayer in silence for the next 3 minutes. Notice where your thoughts are right now and take the opportunity to return to your sacred word. And as our brief centering prayer time comes to a close, take a moment, an additional time in silence to just reflect on this experience. Reminding yourself that you spent this time with God, and that is the whole point. As you're ready, you can start to open your eyes if they're closed, wiggle around a little in your seat, come back to the space. And if anyone would like to share any of your observations, if there's anything you feel comfortable sharing with the group, it can always be beneficial to hear other experiences and to share that together.
I mean, meditation is something that I learned a while ago for mental health. And so this is very different. Like, it was purposely me connecting with God, which was interesting. And for me, I was still like debating the, wandering thoughts and trying to bring it back, hearing the noises that happen, just bringing it back. But the key words and the vision, the image that you had in mind, like, really helped bring it back. But it was kind of healing, because as you're doing the prayers, it's a different kind of prayer than the ritual prayer that one would do in the morning or when you're somewhere. It was a bit deeper, and it felt a little bit more healing and intentional. So it was beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Back here.
So I chose the word healing as my centering word, and when I first started, I'm thinking, okay, who needs to be healed? What's it going to look like? All that kind of stuff, and I think that was my mind wandering. So I started to, I envisioned healing, and I just envisioned warm hands, just the laying on of hands. And every time I started to think, I just went back to that visual along the word, which for me, because I'm everywhere, it was pretty helpful.
And it's beautiful how we each find our own word and image that is right for the moment, right? That image came to you and was grounding. Thank you.
I had ADHD, so this was kind of like going into it was like I was like, this might be a nightmare. But I centered the whole thing on the word whole. And my prayer basically for myself was just like, God, remind me, like, you are who makes me whole. And I really was able to focus really well. I literally did like a brain scan along my body to kind of like feel his presence like throughout, and like just like it was surprisingly easy for me not to be distracted or to like find comfort in the distractions, and then just be like, okay, it was at my shoulders, let's keep going. But yeah, it felt really great.
So I got really stressed out about the whole word thing, so I went the opposite way with it and picked an image. So instead of thinking about a word, I pictured myself at the ocean and just like the waves going in and out and like what that sounded like. And then the word came to me afterwards. So then I was like infinity, like God's infinity and infiniteness love.
It's beautiful.
Thank you. I love this. I love how each person experiences it so differently, and yet there is a similarity in what it's like to really sit with God in this time. Any other reflections on the practice itself?
I noticed I was quite upset at hearing someone refill their coffee cup while I was trying to center myself. That was external, but internally, there was the ebb and flow of all kinds of thoughts and emotions, sort of a swirling ocean of things within myself. I think the practice of mindfulness, if we went on to that, would make us more able to identify what those emotions are and what's unsettling.
And this was from my experience, a very easy environment to actually practice this. The hospital where I practice this often has noises that we can't control, alarms going off, people walking through the room without, knocking. So I joke with my patients, like, if you guys can practice this stuff here, you're golden, right? The rest of the world will be so much easier for you because they have no control over their environment. I have no control over their environment. And so trying to practice prayer when, staff are jingling their keys as they walk down the hall right outside, or they walk in, oh, where's so-and-so? They have an appointment in the middle of your prayer practice. So this, the distractions are real, and also part of the practice is, can we still be with God even when there's distraction, right? Can God be with us in that? I will say, if you want to pick up a copy of the book, I have for each chapter some tips, it has the steps to practice, just like we did here, but it also has a little tips for ways to make it easier, or how to fit it into a busy schedule. So the point of all of this is to make it work for you, right? Find the practices that help you feel connected to God and run with it, right? It's not that there's a right way to do it, and that if you don't do it right, you're failing at prayer. That's not the framework we want at all. These are tools. Use them as you find them meaningful, right? As they help you connect to God. Right? God gives us this history, this rich history of our faith tradition. And now God gives us science to study what's happening in our brains when we practice, which is kind of cool. So, any other questions?
I was just going to say, remind us the numbers of the chapters this week and next week for people who take the book.
Yes, this week it's chapter 1 and chapter 4. So chapter 1 is centering prayer, what we did today, and chapter 4 is practicing the presence of God. Don't have my notes for next week. Do you have the PowerPoint for next week? It should have them. On the second slide. So next week is going to be focused on, okay, now we're aware of God. How do we respond to God? So one of them is the daily examine prayer. I believe it's chapter 2. You would think I would know which chapter.
Move ahead. I can do it.
There we go. Chapter 2 and chapter 8. Chapter 8 is called prayerful savoring. This is a gratitude practice. So we've now learned a little bit about how to become more aware of God's presence. Now, what do we do in response, right? And the examine prayer is about discernment and
making choices in our lives, and the gratitude practice is about finding gratitude and offering thanks for where God is at work. So that's where we're headed for next week. I hope you'll all come back and join us. Thank you all.
Thank you.